Was Jesus a mythical figure? A deep historical and archaeological investigation. For over 2,000 years, the figure of Jesus of Nazareth has stood at the heart of global civilization. His name has inspired revolutions and reforms, his teachings have shaped moral codes and social institutions, and his image is etched into the minds of billions. But despite this enduring legacy, one fundamental question persists. Was Jesus a real historical figure, or merely a myth born from hope, legend, and religious imagination? The debate isn't new. Since the Enlightenment, scholars, skeptics, and theologians have argued about the historical existence of Jesus. Some say he was a radical Jewish preacher, crucified for challenging authority. Others claim he never existed at all, that he is an invention, a collage of ancient myths and messianic expectations. Today we journey through ancient texts, archaeological ruins, and expert testimonies to examine the evidence. We'll explore what the ancient documents really say, whether archaeology supports or challenges the gospel narratives, how similar Jesus' story is to older mythological traditions, and what modern historians and archaeologists actually believe about his existence. Is Jesus a man of history or a story told too well to doubt? Let's uncover the truth. Most of what people know about Jesus comes from the Bible, particularly the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But how reliable are these documents? Let's start with the timeline. The earliest Gospel, generally believed to be Mark, was likely written around 70 AD, about 40 years after Jesus' death. The other three came later over the next few decades. None claim to be eyewitness accounts, and their authors remain anonymous. They often contradict each other on key details, such as the nativity story, the genealogy of Jesus, and even the order of his miracles. So can we trust these writings as historical sources? Critics argue that the Gospels are theological narratives, designed to promote faith, not document history. Yet others note that they contain details unlikely to be invented, such as Jesus' humble origins, his association with tax collectors and sinners, and most notably, his execution by crucifixion, a punishment reserved for the lowest of criminals. Outside the Bible, we find references to Jesus in a handful of Roman and Jewish texts. Tacitus, writing around 116 AD, mentions a man named Christus, who was executed under Pontius Pilate. He describes how the pernicious superstition of Christianity spread from Judea to Rome. Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian writing in the late 1st century, also refers to Jesus. His passage, often called the Testimonium Flavianum, speaks of Jesus as a wise man, a doer of wonderful works, who was crucified and reportedly resurrected. However, most scholars believe parts of this text were altered by later Christian copyists. Pliny the Younger, Lucian of Samosata, and Suetonius also refer to early Christians and indirectly to Jesus, although none provide detailed biographies. While none of these outside sources offer overwhelming proof, they do suggest that early Christians believed in a historical person named Jesus. The question remains, were these beliefs based on memory or myth? What does archaeology tell us about Jesus? It's important to understand. Archaeology rarely provides direct evidence for individuals from ancient history unless they were kings, generals, or emperors. Jesus, if he lived, was a poor carpenter in a rural Roman province. He wouldn't have left behind buildings, inscriptions, or coins. So, we don't expect to find a tomb labeled Jesus of Nazareth, son of Mary. Still, archaeology can verify the context of Jesus' life, the places, the people, and the culture described in the Gospels. Take Nazareth, the town where Jesus was raised. For centuries, critics claimed Nazareth didn't exist in the 1st century. But recent excavations, including a 1st century house discovered beneath a convent in 2009, confirm that a small settlement did exist there during the time Jesus supposedly lived. Capernaum, mentioned frequently in the Gospels as a base of Jesus' ministry, has also yielded ruins of a 1st century synagogue and nearby dwellings. The Pool of Bethesda, where Jesus reportedly healed a paralyzed man, was once thought to be fictional. But archaeologists later uncovered a pool with 5 porticos, just as described in the Gospel of John. Pontius Pilate, long doubted by skeptics, was confirmed by the discovery of the Pilate stone in 1961, a carved limestone block bearing his name and title. Dr. Jody Magnus, a leading biblical archaeologist, says, "While archaeology cannot prove that Jesus existed, it strongly supports the plausibility of the world in which the Gospels place him." However, it's also important to note what archaeology hasn't found. There is no physical evidence of Jesus' crucifixion. Roman crucifixions were brutal and undocumented. Victims were rarely buried with honor. We have found only one crucified skeleton from the entire Roman period, and it offers a grim look into the practice. We also haven't found any contemporary inscriptions or writings that mention Jesus directly. But again, this is not surprising, considering his low social status and the lack of widespread literacy in rural Judea. So while archaeology cannot give us a photo of Jesus or a tombstone with his name, it does validate many of the places, practices, and political figures described in the Gospels, making the story more historically grounded than purely mythical. One of the strongest arguments made by those who doubt Jesus' existence is the striking similarity between his story and those of older myths. Let's look at a few of these parallels. Horus, the Egyptian god, was said to be born of a virgin, was baptized, had 12 disciples, performed miracles, and rose from the dead. Mithras, a Persian deity, was born on December 25th, had a communal meal with followers, and was seen as a savior figure. Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, was born from a divine union, turned water into wine, was killed and resurrected. Skeptics argue that early Christians borrowed from these popular myths to create a figure that would be familiar and spiritually appealing to Gentile audiences. But mainstream scholars dispute these parallels. Dr. Bart Ehrman notes, "Most of the so-called parallels are either exaggerated, misrepresented, or drawn from sources that post-date Christianity." He argues that the core elements of Jesus' story, being a Jewish preacher, executed for sedition, rising again, do not appear in any single pre-Christian myth in the same form. Moreover, early Christianity arose in a deeply Jewish context, with a strict monotheism that rejected pagan myths. For Jesus to be accepted by Jewish followers, he would have had to conform to Jewish expectations, not Greco-Roman ones. Still, the similarities remain intriguing. Could the story of Jesus have been shaped by a broader pattern of savior archetypes common to the ancient world? Was the narrative of death and resurrection, so common in seasonal myths, adapted to a real person's life? Perhaps Jesus was not invented from myth, but myth helped his story spread. So where do scholars actually stand on the question of Jesus' existence? Contrary to what some might think, the overwhelming majority of historians, including atheists and agnostics, agree that Jesus was a real person. The reasons are many. Multiple independent sources. Paul's letters, the Gospels, and later texts, though biased, reflect early traditions about a real man. Embarrassment criterion. Details like Jesus' humble birth, his failure to fulfill Jewish messianic expectations, and his shameful death by crucifixion would have been unlikely fabrications. Rapid spread of Christianity. Within decades, communities throughout the Roman Empire believed in Jesus' life and death. Could such a movement arise purely from fiction? Even critical scholars like John Dominic Crossan, who reject supernatural claims, affirm that a historical Jesus likely existed. Yet mythicists persist, and they ask sharp questions. If Jesus was so important, why didn't contemporary Roman historians write about him? Why did Paul in his letters say almost nothing about Jesus' life and teachings? Why are the gospel stories filled with symbolism, numerology, and Old Testament references? Mythicists like Dr. Robert Price and Dr. Richard Carrier argue that the story of Jesus originated as a spiritual vision, perhaps inspired by Jewish apocalyptic texts, and was later transformed into biography. To them, Jesus is like Hercules, possibly based on a real man, but buried under layers of legend. The debate continues. But for now, history leans heavily toward the existence of Jesus, even if the divine elements of his story remain a matter of faith. In the end, the question of Jesus' existence is not just about history. It's about belief, identity, and the power of story. For believers, Jesus is not just a historical figure. He is the truth, the way, and the life. His story brings purpose, hope, and a moral compass. For skeptics, Jesus may be a symbol of compassion, rebellion, or human longing. Even if not divine, he remains influential. And for historians, Jesus is a figure like many others, complicated, elusive, shaped by time and interpretation. But there's something unique about Jesus. Whether you believe he was God, a prophet, a myth, or just a man, you cannot ignore him. He remains one of the most discussed, depicted, and debated figures in all of history. Maybe the better question isn't, did Jesus exist? But why does his story endure? Why do we keep returning to the man who walked, or may have walked, the dusty roads of Galilee? Because somewhere between history and myth, we find a reflection of ourselves, our fears, our hopes, our hunger for meaning. So, was Jesus real? History offers strong evidence for a man named Jesus of Nazareth, though the details remain debated. Faith offers something deeper, a relationship, a vision, a reason to live. And myth offers us the language to express our eternal questions. Whatever you believe, remember this: stories shape the world, and few stories have shaped it more than this. If this video challenged your thinking, leave a comment below. Do you believe Jesus was a real person, a myth, or something more? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the past, the unknown, and the truth behind belief. Because some questions are too important to ignore.